The trees had been whispering for hours. Dylan had first dismissed it as the wind, but as the sun slanted behind the jagged peaks, he couldn't deny it anymore. The sounds didn't match the rhythm of the breeze, they came in bursts as if unseen lips murmured just out of earshot. He paused on the dirt path, breath coming fast, his skin slick with sweat despite the mountain chill. The map crinkled in his trembling hands, his flashlight beam shaky as he tried to locate where he'd gone wrong. This trail should have ended at the summit overlook. Instead, the trees stretched endlessly in every direction, black veins against a bruised sky. The signposts he'd passed earlier had disappeared, and even the footprints he swore he had left in the muddy earth had been swallowed by the dark. A sickening realization settled in his gut. He was lost. Dylan pulled out his phone. No signal. The battery, which had been at 60% when he checked at the last fork, now flickered at 3%. Impossible. His stomach clenched. A trick of the cold? A malfunction? Then, just as he turned to head back the way he came, he saw it. A footprint. It wasn't his. The print was too deep, too large. Not a boot, but a barefoot, the indent sunken into the damp soil. The toes were long, unnaturally so, with deep, jagged scratches in the dirt leading away from them. Dylan's breath caught. His mind scrambled for an explanation. Someone else is out here. But no one else had been on this trail when he started. He had checked in at the ranger's station hours ago, where the board park employee had assured him that the path was empty today. Too foggy, too cold for most hikers. And yet someone had passed through. He followed the prints, pulse pounding. They led off the trail, winding through dense thickets where the branches seemed to arch toward him like grasping fingers. He hesitated. Going off trail was a bad idea, but the footprint meant someone was nearby. Someone who might help him find his way back. But when he stepped forward, a sound rose from the trees. A low, wheezing inhale, and then a wet, rattling exhale. Dylan spun, flashlight beam jerking wildly. A figure stood between the trees. The man was tall, too tall, his arms hanging almost to his knees. He was naked, his skin a sickly grayish-white. His face was wrong, too wide, the mouth stretched into an unnatural, fixed grin that cut across his cheeks. And he was watching Dylan. Not moving. Just standing. Smiling. Dylan's muscles locked and a scream lodged in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like stone. The man took a step forward. Dylan stumbled back, the flashlight shaking. Hey. His voice cracked. Who are you? The figure didn't respond. His mouth remained frozen in that horrific grin. Then he took another step. And another. Dylan turned and ran. The forest was a blur of black and gray as Dylan crashed through the undergrowth. Branches clawed at his face and jacket, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Behind him, twigs snapped. Footsteps, impossibly fast, closing in. The path had vanished. He was sprinting blind. His breath hitched as he glimpsed something ahead, an old wooden structure, half hidden by the trees. A ranger's cabin? A shed? He didn't care. It was shelter. He practically threw himself inside, slamming the rotting door shut and locking it with the rusted bolt. His heart thundered in his ears. Silence. Then, tap, tap, tap. Dylan's breath shuddered out. The sound came from the window. Slowly, he turned his head. The smiling man stood just outside. His wide, empty eyes peered through the filthy glass. His mouth was open now, revealing rows of blackened teeth. His lips trembled as if trying to form words. A hand lifted. Long fingers tapped against the window. Tap, tap, tap. Dylan clamped a hand over his mouth to stifle a sob. Then, without warning, the tapping stopped. The man's head jerked sharply to the side as though something in the woods had called him. And then he was gone. Vanished. Dylan barely breathed for what felt like hours. His limbs were frozen, his mind trying to rationalize what he had seen. A trick of the light? A hallucination? But the footprints were real. The tapping was real. And worst of all, he was still lost. Shakily, he stood and scanned the cabin's interior. It was abandoned, dust thick on every surface. A single wooden table. A moth-eaten cot. A ladder leading to a dark attic. He swallowed hard. Then, a thump. From above. Dylan stiffened. The noise had come from the attic. His brain screamed at him to leave, but his legs carried him toward the ladder before he could think. If there was someone up there, he needed to know. He reached the top rung, his head slowly rising past the floorboards. And then he saw it. A bundle of something wet and rotting. Twisted flesh. Hair. A face. Dylan recoiled, his foot slipping. He crashed down the ladder, pain exploding in his back. But before he could scramble away, the face in the attic moved. A single, bloodshot eye rolled in its socket. And then, From the darkness above, a voice like cracking bone whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." Dylan scrambled away from the ladder, his hands clawing at the dusty wooden floor as he tried to get up. His ribs ached where he had landed, but the pain was drowned out by sheer terror. The thing in the attic had spoken. The words still slithered in his ears. "You shouldn't have come here." A dry, gurgling breath rasped from the darkness above. Dylan didn't dare look up. He shoved himself to his feet, chest heaving. The ladder creaked. Something was moving. Dylan's mind screamed at him to run. He lunged for the door, hands fumbling at the rusted lock. His fingers were slick with sweat, slipping uselessly. Then, behind him, a wet thud. Something had dropped from the attic. A thick, putrid scent flooded his nostrils, like spoiled meat left in the sun. His pulse spiked as he slowly turned. A heap of flesh lay on the floor. At first, it was impossible to tell what it was. A misshapen mass of twisted skin, ribs jutting at unnatural angles like someone had been crumpled and folded in on themselves. Then the thing moved. Dylan choked back bile. The broken shape twitched, its fingers curling backward, long and gnarled, bending like snapped twigs. The head lifted. Faces. There were several stitched together, overlapping. Too many eyes, too many mouths. Some frozen in silent screams. Others locked in grins too wide, splitting across their cheeks. And one of the mouths moved. It stretched open, far too far, the jaw cracking as something inside spoke. "Where is your skin?" Dylan screamed. He didn't think, he just ran. The door slammed open as he stumbled outside, the cold air slapping him in the face. He sprinted blindly into the trees, his mind consumed by panic. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. And then, shuffling, that sickening, wet sound of something dragging itself forward. Dylan forced himself to keep moving, his legs burning. The branches clawed at him, snapping against his jacket. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The sounds behind him grew louder. He could hear bones grinding, wet footsteps slapping against the dirt. Too fast. The trees blurred as he ran. His lungs screamed for air. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it would explode. Then, the ground vanished beneath his feet. Dylan let out a strangled yell as he tumbled forward, down into the earth. The fall wasn't far, but he landed hard. His shoulder cracked against the ground, pain lancing up his arm. He gasped, blinking away stars. His flashlight was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Pit. He had fallen into a hole. Cold, damp soil pressed against his skin as he struggled to sit up. His breath came in ragged gasps. The walls were steep, smooth, unnatural. Above, the trees loomed, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching down. The wind moaned through them, carrying something else with it. A whisper. "Dyyylan." His stomach nodded. That voice, not human, not from the wind. Something was above the pit, watching. A shadow blocked the moonlight. A long, gnarled hand reached down. Dylan's blood turned to ice. He scrambled back, pressing against the dirt wall. His fingers clawed at the soil, desperate for a way out. But the pit was deep, and the hand, that thing's hand, was reaching closer. His fingers twitched. Its nails scraped against the earth. "Come back." The voice was inside his skull. Dylan let out a shattered scream. The air around him changed. It wasn't just a hole. The dirt, it pulsed. Beneath his hands, the soil shifted, like something inside it was breathing. He choked, scrambling to his feet. He had to get out. Now, the shadow above him moved. The smiling man, or whatever it was, had tilted its head, its wide mouth twisting. Then, the ground beneath Dylan's feet moved. The soil sank. He stumbled, falling to his knees as something below him pressed against the earth. Not roots, not stone, something alive. He could feel bones shifting beneath his hands. A heartbeat. The hole was not a hole. It was a mouth, and it was opening. 10. Devoured by the earth. A horrible sucking sound filled the air. Dylan's legs sank. The dirt clung to him, pulling him downward. the way a spider's web tightens around prey. He fought, kicking, clawing at the walls, but the soil moved like muscle, pressing him deeper into its throat. Above, the smiling man just watched. His eyes never blinked. His grin never faltered. And then, the whispers began again. "It takes you. It takes you. It takes you." Dylan screamed. The earth swallowed him whole. Dirt pressed into Dylan's mouth. His screams were muffled as the soil forced its way between his teeth, his throat convulsing as he gagged. He thrashed, his limbs sinking deeper into the living ground, the pressure tightening around his chest like a vice. He tried to breathe, only soil. His ears filled with a deep, guttural groan, not from above, but from inside the earth itself. The whispers had stopped. Now there was only breathing, and it was not his. Something huge was awake below. Then, light, not from the moon, not from his flashlight. It pulsed beneath him, a sickly red glow that bled through the soil, illuminating what lay below. Dylan's breath hitched. There were faces. Dozens. Hundreds. Pressed beneath the earth like flies in amber. Their features twisted, locked in silent screams. Their mouths moved without sound, their lips forming the same, endless, wordless plea. Help! A horrible realization crashed into him. These were the others. The lost. The hikers who never came back. They weren't dead. They were trapped. Dylan felt something touch his ankle. Not a root. Not a rock. A hand. It tightened. The glow beneath him flared brighter. Then the faces shifted. They turned toward him. Every single one. Hundreds of rotting, screaming eyes locking onto his. And all at once, in a chorus of voices that did not belong to them. They spoke. Let it take you. 13. The smiling thing returns. Dylan's body exploded into motion. He ripped himself free, his legs kicking as he clawed upward, upward, upward. The earth fought him, the soil dragging him down, but he did not stop. He reached, his fingers breaking against the dirt, and finally, air. His head burst from the ground, his lungs sucking in a shuddering gasp. He pulled himself free, collapsing onto the cold forest floor, retching up mouthfuls of dirt. The whispering started again. But this time, it was laughter. Dylan's body locked. The laughter was close. He turned, the blood draining from his face. The smiling man stood at the edge of the pit. His grin had widened. His mouth was wrong, split open to his ears, teeth stretching endlessly into the darkness of his throat. And when he spoke, it was not with his mouth, but with every mouth in the earth below. "You belong here." Dylan ran. Branches whipped past him as he crashed through the trees, his pulse hammering in his skull. There was no path, only darkness. But then, impossibly, it was there. A trail. It should not have been there. It was wrong. But Dylan didn't care. He took it. His feet pounded against the dirt as he sprinted forward, breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees blurred past him, their shapes twisting, bodies pressing through the bark, arms reaching. He didn't look. He couldn't. A signpost loomed ahead, broken and splintered, but he recognized it. He knew this trail. It led back to the ranger station. Home. Safety. He pushed harder. Then, the laughter stopped. The whispers ceased. A silence fell over the woods, heavier than the night itself. Dylan slowed. Something was wrong. He knew this path. And yet, it was too straight, too perfect. His stomach twisted. Something waited ahead. And when he rounded the final bend, his heart stopped. The ranger station was gone. In its place, the cabin. The same rotting shack where he had hidden before. Where the thing had tapped at the window. It had been miles away. And yet, here it was. The door stood open, waiting. The trees behind him shifted. Dylan turned, his stomach dropping. The forest was closing in. The path was gone, swallowed by the blackness of the trees. There was no way out, only forward. The door of the cabin creaked, swinging wider. And from the darkness inside, something breathed. Dylan took a step back. Then, from the doorway, a hand emerged. Gray, long fingers twitching. And from the blackness beyond, the voice returned. You came home. The smiling man stepped forward. And this time, he wasn't alone. The smiling man stepped forward. And behind him, they followed. Figures crawled from the darkness of the cabin, spilling into the clearing like cockroaches. Some walked on twisted legs. Some dragged themselves, their bodies broken, their faces twisted in grins too wide, splitting their cheeks into wet, red wounds. Some had no faces at all. Just smooth, pale flesh stretched over their skulls, their heads tilting unnaturally as they turned toward Dylan. One of them spoke, not with lips, but with the mouths on its stomach. Stay. Dylan's stomach lurched. He took a step back only for his heel to hit the forest. The trees had moved closer. The trunks pressed together, sealing the path like a clenched fist. There was no exit. Only the cabin. And the things waiting inside it. A high-pitched noise pierced the air. Not human. Not animal. Something between screaming and laughing. It came from the cabin. Dylan's chest seized. The smiling man tilted his head at the sound, his grin somehow widening. Then he stepped aside. The cabin's door yawned open. An invitation. Dylan's entire body revolted. No. 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 He turned, ran for the trees, his hands clawing at the trunks. But the bark was soft. Rotten. It pulsed under his fingers like skin. A heartbeat thumped inside the wood. Something shifted beneath it. Dylan ripped his hands away. He had no choice. He turned, facing the cabin again. The things were waiting. Their grins shone in the dark. The smiling man raised his arm and pointed inside. Dylan's mind splintered. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, but there was nowhere to go. The clearing was shrinking. The trees pressed closer. There was only one way out. Forward. Into the cabin. His hands trembled as he stepped toward it. The figures did not move, they only watched. Their eyes followed him. All but one. One of them, one of the faceless ones, twitched. A sharp, spasming movement. Its body convulsed. And then, from the smooth, stretched flesh of its head, a mouth ripped open. Too wide. Too deep. And it screamed. A sound like a splitting bone. Dylan staggered. His ears rang. The world tilted. And before he could think, before he could stop himself, his foot crossed the threshold. He had entered the cabin. The door slammed shut. 19. What's inside? Darkness engulfed him. The walls shivered. The air was thick, humid, like the inside of a mouth. Dylan fumbled for his flashlight, his fingers shaking. He clicked it on. The inside of the cabin was wrong. It was not wood. Not stone. The walls were flesh. Pale, veined. They twitched under the beam of light. A pulse rippled through them. Like breathing. The floor soft. He stepped forward. It squished. A sharp, wet breath echoed from the darkness. Dylan froze. His flashlight flickered. Something moved inside the walls. He could hear it. Something huge. Something waiting. Then, the whispering returned. You were inside it now. Dylan's stomach plummeted. He wasn't in a cabin. He was in a body. And it was alive. The floor convulsed. A tremor shook the room. Dylan stumbled. The whispering grew louder. It's waking up. It sees you now. His flashlight died. Total. Darkness. Something wet shifted. Dylan's breath stopped. A long, rattling inhale filled the air. And then, the lights came on. Not from his flashlight. Not from a bulb. The walls glowed. Veins lit up beneath the skin of the cabin, pulsing with a sick, yellow light. And in that glow Dylan saw it. Hanging from the ceiling. It was wearing a body. But it was not human. The skin hung loosely on its bones. Its arms too long. Its fingers too thin. Its face not its own. A mask of stolen flesh stretched over something that had no shape. Dylan tried to move. Tried to breathe. But the thing was already watching him. Its head tilted. The stolen lips peeled back. And from deep inside its throat, in a voice that was not its own, it spoke. You fit me well. Dylan screamed. Dylan's scream choked in his throat. The thing hanging from the ceiling shifted, its stolen skin sagging as it moved. The flesh it wore was stitched together, seams oozing where it didn't fit right. It had no real shape. Just a mask beneath that stretched, human covering. The eyes weren't real. Just holes. Dark pits where something else squirmed inside. And it was watching him. You fit me well. The voice wasn't a voice. Not really. It was layers of voices, all speaking at once, some male, some female, some broken beyond recognition. Dylan staggered back. The walls pulsed. The cabin was alive. And it wanted him. The thing dropped. Not like a person. Like a puppet with its strings cut. It hit the ground in a wet, boneless heap. Dylan's breath shattered. He turned, ran. The floor rippled beneath him like stepping across a giant tongue. Behind him, the thing twitched. Then, it spoke again. No. No. Not like that. You must crawl. Dylan's legs locked. The voice burrowed inside his skull. A command. His knees buckled. No. He fought it, his muscles straining, but his body betrayed him. His knees hit the ground. His hands pressed into the pulsing floor. And he began to crawl. The walls tightened. The hall ahead narrowed. Dylan's body moved on its own. His fingers sank into the wet, pulsing flesh beneath him. The light from the veins in the walls turned a deeper red. Like blood. Like he was inside something enormous, something alive. a tunnel of flesh, and in the dim, oozing light, he saw them. Figures, crawling ahead of him, their bodies skinned raw, muscles twitching as they pulled themselves forward. They were like him, the lost ones. We did not run. We did not fight. So we were taken. Dylan's stomach lurched. He tried to stop. His fingers dug into the floor, but his body kept crawling, moving toward the others, toward the thing waiting ahead, waiting to wear him. The tunnel shuddered. The skinned ones moaned. And then, ahead of him, the tunnel opened. Not into a room, not into a cabin, into a mouth, a gaping chasm of teeth and flesh, its walls slick, lined with ribs. It breathed. It was awake. Crawl inside. The voice wasn't spoken. It was inside him, like his own thoughts weren't his anymore. Dylan's body kept moving. His fingers dragged against the floor, his mouth opening in a silent scream. No, no, no. Then, a hand grabbed his ankle. Dylan was ripped backward. His body snapped free from whatever force was pulling him, tumbling onto the flesh floor. His head cracked against the ground. The moment broke. His body was his again. He gasped, twisting, and saw who had saved him. A man. A ranger. His uniform was torn, his beard wild, his eyes hollow. Move, the ranger hissed. Before it takes you. Dylan scrambled to his feet. Behind them, the mouth was closing. The skinned ones wailed. The walls shuddered. The thing that wore flesh was coming. The ranger grabbed Dylan's arm, dragged him. And together, they ran. The walls convulsed. Dylan stumbled as the floor twisted beneath him, slick and pulsing. The tunnel around them shrank as though the cabin itself was swallowing them. The ranger pulled him forward, his grip iron tight on Dylan's wrist. Don't stop. Don't look back. His voice was hoarse, raw like he had been screaming for years. Dylan didn't ask questions. Behind them, the thing that had tried to wear his skin let out a wet, gurgling shriek. The walls trembled. The tunnel ahead twisted. Then, the floor gave out. Dylan fell. Not onto the ground. Into something else. The air changed as he plummeted, the tunnel vanishing above him, the flickering red light swallowed in darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound. No walls. Just the sense of falling forever. Then, impact. Dylan's body slammed into something cold and wet. His vision flashed white with pain. He gasped, his ribs screaming, his hands sinking into the floor beneath him. It was not flesh. It was mud. 28. Back in the forest. Dylan gasped for air. The smell of damp earth filled his nose, choking him. He rolled onto his back and saw the sky. Not the vein-lit horror of the cabin's insides. The real sky. A black, starless void stretched above him, moonlight weak against the swirling fog. The forest. He was back in the woods. Dylan's chest heaved. He sat up, looked around. The ranger stood nearby, his hands on his knees, panting. His clothes were covered in filth, his hat missing, his skin gray with exhaustion. We made it, the ranger wheezed. Dylan's breath shook. What was that? The ranger's face twisted. It's not a place, he murmured. It's a thing. And it's always been here. Dylan's stomach nodded. What do you mean? That cabin. The ranger let out a bitter laugh. It wasn't a cabin. It was its mouth. Dylan stared. His head spun as memories of the last few hours rushed back. The impossible paths. The faces beneath the dirt. The smiling man. I don't understand. Dylan's voice shook. The ranger turned to him, his expression dark. This place, it's alive. The forest isn't just a forest. The trails move. The signs change. It's all part of it. He paused. It lets people in, but it doesn't let them out. Dylan's blood ran cold. You mean, we're still in it? The ranger's jaw clenched. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. A crack echoed through the woods. Dylan and the ranger froze. Another snap. Like bones breaking. Slow, deliberate, and close. Dylan's heart slammed against his ribs. It followed us, the ranger whispered. Dylan's breath caught. We need to move, the ranger said. Now. He turned, started toward the trees. Dylan hesitated. Then, a voice. Right behind him. Why are you leaving? Dylan's blood curdled. His stomach lurched. He knew that voice. He had heard it in the cabin. He had heard it in his head. He turned slowly and saw it. The smiling man, standing barefoot in the mud. His grin wider than before. His body wrong. Too tall. Too thin. His limbs twitched like something inside was adjusting. And then, his skin shuddered. Dylan's chest seized. The smiling man's face was changing. The features melted, twisted, reshaping. Dylan's stomach turned to ice. Because now, the smiling man was wearing his own face. Dylan screamed. Dylan's body locked in place. His mind screamed run, but his legs wouldn't move. The smiling man stood just a few feet away, wearing his face. It was perfect. Too perfect. The same jawline. The same eyes. But wrong. Because the grin didn't belong there. It stretched too wide, too deep, splitting at the corners like someone had peeled his skin apart. And the eyes. They weren't human anymore. Just pits of shifting blackness, swirling like a void that had learned how to look back. Then, the smiling Dylan tilted his head, his stolen mouth twitching. You should not have left. Dylan felt something snap inside his mind. He turned, ran. The ranger was already moving. Don't stop, he barked. No matter what. Dylan didn't need convincing. Behind them, footsteps pounded through the mud. Too fast. The thing that wore his face was catching up. The trees blurred past as Dylan ran, his breath burning in his throat. His legs screamed, but terror kept him moving. Then, a loud snap. Like bone breaking. Then another. The sound wasn't just behind them anymore. It was all around. The forest was waking up. Dylan's stomach twisted. The ranger swore under his breath then. He stopped running. Dylan nearly crashed into him. What the hell are you doing? The ranger didn't answer. He just turned, pulled out a gun, and fired. 33. Bullets don't work. The shot echoed through the trees. A single, clean hit. Dylan's ears rang. For a moment, silence. Then, laughter. The thing didn't fall. It didn't bleed. It laughed. A warped, twisted sound. Like Dylan's own voice played backwards. Then, it opened its mouth. And kept opening. The jaw unhinged, bone-splitting, stretching too far as a black pit of teeth yawned wide. It was hungry. It was coming. The ranger fired again. 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 The thing laughed. Then it spoke. You don't understand. The bullets fell from its mouth, clinking against the ground like spit-out teeth. It stepped forward, and the forest moved with it. The trees around them shifted. The branches twisted together, forming shapes. Not random ones. Faces. Grinning. Watching. Their mouths stretched open, black pits of nothingness, whispering. Come back. Stay. You are home. The forest wasn't letting them leave. Dylan's breath shook. The smiling man, his own face, stepped closer. The ground groaned. Dylan felt it beneath his feet. A pulse. A heartbeat. The forest wasn't just alive. It was one thing. One massive thing. And they were inside it. The ranger grabbed his arm. Move. They ran. The whispering grew louder. The faces in the trees stretched, their mouths opening wider, wider, as if they were all about to scream. Then, something rose in the distance. Dylan's heart stopped. A fire tower. Old, rusted, its metal frame towering above the trees. Dylan's stomach twisted. That wasn't there before. The ranger didn't hesitate. It is now. They ran toward it. Behind them, the trees screamed. Not voices. Not human. Something deep and wrong vibrating through the forest like a starving beast. The tower's ladder stretched upward, disappearing into the fog. There was nowhere else to go. The ranger grabbed the rungs, started climbing. Dylan followed. The smiling thing reached the base just as they climbed out of reach. It looked up and grinned. Where will you go? It whispered. Dylan kept climbing. They were out of time. Dylan's hands ached as he climbed. The metal rungs were cold, slick with moisture, his palms burning from gripping too tight. Below him, the ranger climbed fast, his breath ragged. And under them both the smiling thing stood at the base of the tower. Watching. Grinning. Not moving. Just waiting. Dylan swallowed hard. What if it follows us? He called down. The ranger didn't look up. Then we're already dead. Dylan's blood ran cold. He climbed faster. The fire tower stretched high above the trees, lost in thick fog. The metal groaned with every movement like it hadn't been used in years. Then, they reached the top. A rusted hatch stood above them. The ranger grabbed it. Pulled. It didn't budge. Help me. Dylan climbed beside him, throwing his weight into it. The hatch creaked, shuddered, then suddenly snapped open. A rush of cold air hit them. Dylan froze. Something was wrong. The air didn't feel right. It was too still. Too silent. The ranger climbed up first. Dylan followed, pulling himself through the hatch and into somewhere else. Dylan landed on wood. Not the metal grating of the fire tower platform. Not the rooftop of a lookout station. This was a room. A small, dimly lit room. An oil lamp flickered on a wooden table. Old maps covered the walls, curling at the edges. A radio sat in the corner, silent, its dials rusted. Dylan's stomach twisted. What the hell is this? The ranger didn't answer. He was staring at the door. Because it wasn't a fire tower door. It was an old wooden door with a brass handle. And on the other side, something moved. A shadow passed under the door. Dylan's breath hitched. The ranger stepped back. And then, a knock. Soft, gentle, rhythmic. Dylan's stomach clenched. The knocking didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. Steady. Waiting. Dylan's hands shook. What happens if we open it? He whispered. The ranger didn't look at him. You don't want to know. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then, the handle turned. Dylan backed away. The door creaked open. Just a sliver. Not enough to see what was beyond it, but enough for something to come through. A hand. Thin. Gray. Fingers too long, knuckles bulging. It gripped the edge of the door. Slowly. Pulling it wider. Dylan couldn't breathe. The ranger moved first. He grabbed the oil lamp, and threw it. The room exploded in fire. The lamp shattered. Flames bloomed across the wooden floor. Dylan stumbled back as fire roared to life, licking at the walls, swallowing the maps, casting twisted shadows. The door was still open. The hand was still there. But now it was burning. And it didn't move. Didn't jerk away. Didn't scream. Just held on. As if it couldn't feel the flames. Dylan's skin crawled. Then, the hand pulled back. And the door slammed shut. The fire raged. Thick, black smoke churned upward, but there was no ceiling. Just more darkness. The room shuddered. The wooden walls warped, stretching outward like the space was growing. Dylan grabbed the ranger's arm. What the hell is happening? The ranger's eyes darkened. It's not letting us leave. Dylan's chest tightened. The flames should have spread. But instead, they went out. Like they had been swallowed. The smoke lingered. Thick. Heavy. And inside it, something moved. Dylan's stomach dropped. A shape shifted in the smoke. Tall. Thin. Too long-limbed. A grin stretched wide through the darkness. A mouth too large, too deep, filled with teeth that weren't human. The smiling man had found them. You came inside. The voice was his, but warped. Spoken through layers of other voices. The smoke curled, swirling around the figure like it was part of it. Like it was inside it. Dylan's legs locked. The ranger pulled him backward. Don't listen. Don't look at it. Dylan's voice shook. How do we get out? The ranger's jaw clenched. We don't. The room groaned. The floorboards trembled beneath their feet. Then, they split open. Not like wood cracking. Like lips parting. A mouth. A huge, gaping mouth in the floor, lined with rows of blackened teeth. From below, something breathed. A long, rattling inhale. Like it was smelling them. Like it was hungry. The smiling man stepped forward. Go back. Let it take you. This is where you belong. Dylan staggered back. The ranger's grip tightened. Jump. Dylan's head snapped toward him. What? The ranger's eyes burned. Better the fall than the mouth. Dylan looked down into the darkness beyond the floor. There was no ground. Just nothing. A void. A bottomless drop. The smiling man took another step. The mouth in the floor yawned wider. The breath grew stronger, pulling them toward it. The ranger didn't hesitate. He grabbed Dylan's arm and jumped. Dylan's scream was lost in the void. The darkness swallowed them whole. Falling. 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 But there was no impact. No ground rushing up to meet them. Just falling forever. Dylan's mind spiraled. He could feel the air shifting around him. No. Not air. Not wind. Something else. Something alive. Something whispering. You can't leave. The darkness tightened. It was closing in. Squeezing them. And from far, far below it, a second voice rose. A deep, ancient rumbling voice. Let him go. The darkness shattered. And suddenly, Dylan was awake. Lying on the ground. In the forest. As if none of it had ever happened. Dylan gasped for air. The ground beneath him was cold, damp soil. The smell of pine and earth filled his lungs. He was back. Back in the forest. The sky stretched above him, black and empty, swirling with thick, heavy clouds. The ranger lay nearby, face down in the dirt, breathing heavily. It felt real. But something was wrong. The air was too still. The trees too perfect. Like they weren't really trees at all. Dylan's stomach twisted. Did we make it out? The ranger sat up, rubbing his temples. His face was pale. He didn't answer. Dylan got to his feet. His legs were shaking. But he forced himself to breathe. Where are we? He asked. The ranger finally looked up. His expression was grim. We never left. Dylan's heart pounded. What? The ranger stood. Gestured toward the trees. Look. Dylan turned. And froze. There, just a few yards ahead, was a trail. A dirt path winding through the trees. A trail Dylan recognized. His breath caught, because it was the same trail he had started on. The one that led into the forest. The one that had trapped him here. It had looped. He had never really left. Dylan's mind reeled. No. He shook his head. No, that's not possible. We got out. We got away. A whisper cut through the air. Did you? Dylan's blood ran cold. It came from the trees. The voices he had heard before. They were back. The ranger turned, jaw clenched. It's still watching. Dylan's throat went dry. How do we get out? The whispers laughed. The trees shifted. And from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. Dylan's breath hitched. The figure was tall, thin, familiar. It stepped into the moonlight, and Dylan's stomach dropped. It was him. Himself. But not. The same face. The same clothes. But twisted. Its mouth stretched too wide. Its eyes were empty pits. And when it spoke, it used his voice. Why are you running, Dylan? Dylan staggered back. No. No, this isn't real. The thing smiled. But it is. And then, it moved. The ranger pulled Dylan back. Move. But Dylan couldn't. He was frozen. His own face was staring at him. Grinning. Watching. Waiting. And then, it stepped closer. You belong here, Dylan. The whispers swelled. The trees groaned. The forest itself was closing in. And Dylan knew it. There was no way out. Dylan couldn't breathe. The thing in front of him was him. Not a copy. Not a shadow. It was wearing him. His own face smiled back. His own voice whispered. Why do you run? The forest listened. The trees held their breath. Even the air was waiting. Dylan's stomach twisted. You're not real. The thing laughed. A sound too human and not human at all. Neither are you. The ranger stepped between them. His breath was shallow. His fingers twitched toward his gun. Don't listen to it, he muttered. Dylan's heart pounded. What is it? The ranger didn't answer. But the thing did. I am what comes next. Dylan swallowed hard. Next? The thing's grin widened. I take what is left. I become what is lost. It tilted its head, watching him. And you were lost, Dylan. You were already mine. The forest shifted. Dylan felt it. The ground trembled just slightly. And behind the smiling thing, a new path opened. A trail leading into the deep woods. It hadn't been there before. Dylan's stomach churned. The thing stepped aside, gesturing toward the path. It's time to go. The whispers returned. Soft. Encouraging. Yes. Go. You have always been here. You have always belonged. Dylan's mind fractured. It was pulling him in. Pulling him deeper. His feet twitched. His breath faltered. The ranger grabbed his arm. Dylan. Look at me. Dylan's head snapped toward him. The ranger's face was hard. His eyes dark with warning. It wants you to choose this. It can't take you unless you let it. Dylan's body stiffened. He looked at the thing wearing his face. It was still smiling. Waiting. And for the first time, Dylan realized. It was nervous. It needed him to walk forward. Needed him to give up. Dylan's breath shuddered out. He took a step back. The thing's smile twitched. Its eyes darkened. Dylan. A whisper. You were lost. Dylan's jaw locked. No. The thing flinched. You are nothing without me. Dylan gritted his teeth. Then I'll be nothing. The forest shuddered. The whispers cracked. The trees groaned. And the smiling thing. It screamed. A sound like tearing flesh. Like splitting wood. Like 1,000 voices breaking at once. Then, it lurched forward. The ranger moved first. He yanked Dylan backward. Pulled out his knife. And lunged. The blade sank deep into the smiling thing's chest. It let out a shriek. Not of pain, but of rage. The sky cracked open. The forest howled. The ground rippled beneath them. And then, everything went black. Everything was gone. No light. No sound. No breath. Dylan floated in nothingness, his body weightless, his mind flickering on the edge of consciousness. He couldn't see. Couldn't move. Then, a noise. Faint. Distant. Like the cracking of wood. Or the breaking of bones. A whisper followed. You made a mistake. Dylan's lungs clenched. Something was beside him. In the darkness. Waiting. Watching. Then, all at once, the world came back. Dylan gasped, coughing up dirt. His body was pressed against the cold ground. His skin was damp. His head throbbed. He forced his eyes open. The forest was still there. But something was different. The trees weren't moving anymore. The whispers were gone. The smiling thing was nowhere in sight. Dylan turned, saw the ranger nearby stirring. He was alive. They had survived. But something was wrong. The sky had changed. The moon was still there, but it was too big, too close. It loomed overhead, a massive, swollen eye, its surface slick and pulsing, its craters deep like empty sockets. And it was watching them. Dylan's stomach twisted. Where are we? The ranger sat up, his face grim. Not home. A wind picked up, but it didn't feel natural. It was wet, heavy, like something was breathing against them. Dylan turned, and his stomach flipped. The trees were bleeding. Thick, black sap oozed from their bark, running in slow, sticky streams. It smelled wrong. Not like sap. Not like wood. Like blood. Like flesh. The ranger stood, gripping his knife. We need to move. Dylan's legs locked. Move where? The ranger's jaw tightened. Anywhere but here. Dylan glanced around. The forest stretched endlessly. But ahead of them, there was a path. A thin, winding trail cutting through the bleeding trees. Dylan's gut twisted. No. No more paths. The ranger turned. His face was pale. We don't have a choice. Dylan's breath shook. He looked at the path. It looked back. Waiting. Watching. Dylan swallowed. Then, they stepped forward, and the forest swallowed them whole. Dylan's feet felt heavy as he walked. The path stretched ahead, winding through the bleeding trees. The air was thick. Wet. Like he was walking through a living throat. He didn't want to look down. Didn't want to see what the path was made of. But the more they walked, the more he felt it. Soft. Pulsing. Like flesh beneath his boots. He gritted his teeth. How do we know this leads anywhere? The ranger didn't answer, because there was no way to know. Dylan took another step, and the ground moved beneath him. Not like earth shifting. Like something crawling underneath. He froze. So did the ranger. Then, a hand broke through the dirt. Gray. Rotting. Fingers twitching. Dylan's chest seized. Another hand clawed out. Then another. And another. The path was full of them. Hands pushing through the soil. Grasping. Reaching. For him. The ranger grabbed Dylan's arm. Don't stop. Keep moving. Dylan's skin crawled. They're everywhere. The ranger's jaw tightened. I know. They kept walking. And the hands kept reaching. But they never grabbed. Never pulled. Just touched the ground. Fingers twitching. Like they were feeling the path. Like they were making sure it was still there. The forest grew darker. The air thicker. Dylan's breath came fast. The trees whispered. Not just any whispers. His name. Dylan. Dylan, come back. His stomach turned. He recognized those voices. His mother. His father. His own voice. You've always been here, Dylan. Just come back. His feet faltered. The ranger grabbed his shoulder. Don't listen. Dylan's head snapped up. The ranger's eyes were wide. Keep walking. Now. Dylan's pulse pounded. The whispers grew louder. Then, the trees moved. The branches twisted. The roots pulled up. The path narrowed. The forest was closing in. It didn't want them to leave. It was done waiting. Dylan's lungs burned. What do we do? The ranger looked up. His face was set. We run. Dylan shook his head. What if we're going the wrong way? The ranger's voice was sharp. There is no right way. There's only forward. Then, they ran. The forest screamed. Not voices. Not wind. The trees themselves. The ground buckled. The path twisted. Dylan stumbled, his vision blurring. The trees were changing. Their bark peeled back. Beneath it, not wood, not roots, but skin, pale, veined. The forest was not a forest. It was a body, and it was waking up. Dylan gasped. Ahead, clearing, a way out. They ran faster, and the trees reached for them. Dylan ran. The ground twisted beneath him, buckling like muscle under skin. It wasn't earth anymore. It was alive, and it knew they were on it. The trees pulsed, their bark peeling back, exposing raw, fleshy walls beneath. They weren't trees at all. They were ribs, and they were closing in. Faster! The ranger shouted. Dylan's lungs burned. His heart slammed against his ribs. The clearing was ahead, the only way out, but the forest wasn't letting them go. 67. The open space that shouldn't exist. They burst through the trees. Dylan staggered forward, his legs shaking, and stopped. The clearing was wrong. It was huge, too big, too open. The trees didn't line the edge. They loomed above, like ribs of a great hollow beast. Dylan's stomach plummeted. This isn't a clearing. The ranger's breath hitched. No, it's a chamber. Dylan turned, his hands shaking, and saw it. In the center of the clearing, rising from the ground, was something huge, something old, something waiting. It had no shape. It had many shapes. His body stretched and shifted, made of limbs that weren't limbs, mouths that weren't mouths. It was part of the forest. It was the forest, and it had been waiting for them. A single mouth peeled open. A voice spoke from everywhere at once. You do not belong outside me. Dylan's blood turned to ice. It wasn't just a monster. It wasn't just a place. It was both. The forest was a body, and they were inside it. The ground shuddered. The trees groaned. The mouths along the creature's body twitched. Waiting. The ranger grabbed Dylan's arm. We don't stop. We keep moving. Dylan's breath shook. Where? There's nowhere to go. The ranger's eyes were wild. We make a way. Then, he ran straight at the thing. Dylan's brain screamed. Are you insane? The ranger didn't stop. Neither could Dylan. He clenched his teeth and ran after him. The creature shifted. Its mouths twitched. Its limbs unfolded. It was ready to swallow them. Then, paused. The ground stilled. The air grew heavy, and something changed. The thing's voices wavered, like it was uncertain, like it had never had to chase something before. Dylan's mind raced. It had always trapped people, made them give up, made them choose to stay. But Dylan and the ranger weren't stopping. They were fighting, and for the first time, the hollow thing didn't know what to do. The clearing shook. The world tilted, and then everything collapsed. Dylan's vision cracked apart, and he was falling. Again, Dylan plummeted. The world fractured around him, splintering into dark, twisting shapes. The forest was gone. The thing that had been the forest was gone. There was only falling. The wind howled past his ears, but there was no ground rushing up to meet him. Just endless, impossible darkness. Then, a hand grabbed his wrist. The ranger, holding onto him tightly, not letting go. And for the first time, Dylan understood. It had never been about escaping. It had always been about not letting the hollow take them. Fed on lost things. It needed them to surrender, to believe there was no way out. And Dylan wouldn't let that happen. He grabbed the ranger's arm, held on. And together, they stopped falling. The air around them cracked. The hollow screamed, not in rage, not in anger, but in confusion, like it had never lost something before. The darkness split open. A sliver of light appeared beneath them. Blinding. Real. The sky. The real sky. And before Dylan could think, the light swallowed him whole. And he hit the ground. Dylan gasped awake. His body was pressed against hard, dry earth. Sunlight warmed his face. Birds chirped overhead. And for the first time in what felt like years, the forest was just a forest. He sat up, his head spinning. The trees stood still. The air was normal. There was no whispering, no watching, no smiling thing waiting in the trees. He was back. The trailhead sign stood just a few feet away. Like he had never left. Like the hollow had spit him out. Because it had lost. Dylan's heart raced. He turned looking for the ranger. But he was gone. No footprints. No sign he had ever been there. Dylan's stomach dropped. No. He stood up, spun in circles, searching the trees. Hey, nothing. The forest was empty. The ranger had saved him. And now, he was gone. Maybe he had never escaped. Maybe the hollow had kept him. Or maybe that was the price to leave. One person goes. One person stays. 75, the last path. Dylan's breath shook. He turned toward the trailhead. Back toward his car. Back toward home. But before he took a step, something caught his eye. The trees. Just beyond the clearing, deep in the shadows. A figure stood, watching. Not the smiling thing. Not the hollow. But a man in a torn ranger's uniform. His hat missing. His face hidden in shadow. Dylan's heart pounded. He took a step forward. But the figure turned and walked back into the forest. And this time, the trees didn't move. They just swallowed him whole. Dylan stood there frozen. He knew what it meant. Some things aren't meant to leave. And some people, are meant to stay. Slowly he turned and took the first step home.